So let's have a look at how we can approach the dialogue system in itself and what are the components that we need for the dialogue system. So if I say I need dialogue, and the dialogue can be for the player or it can be for the NPC, and the same goes for text as well. So this dialogue will have some kind of text and that will need to be dynamically applied. So we'll need something like conversation 1, dialogue, player, and then the text for that. And let's say this is going to be the NPC speaking, and if I duplicate this, we have another component called options. Let me name that as options. And for the options, we will need just the number of options as well as the text. So these are the variables that we need. And let's say after the NPC talks, we'll need to select between 3 options. So I'm gonna apply that as a variable here, 3 options. And these 3 options will have a particular text. So this can be our array. If you're not familiar with a string array, we'll look at that. And for the dialogue, we can have just a bool. Let's say this is the bool where 0 is player and 1 is NPC. And by 0 and 1, I mean false and true. So if I connect these two to this one, I think we have most of it covered. And this can be broken down into even further pieces. In the same way we are detecting if the dialogue is going to be players or NPCs, we can have the same system by a bool to decide whether this is going to be a dialogue or this is going to be an option, since we only have 2 kinds of interactions right now. So that I'll just put that on top of the whole thing. And if I look at conversation 1 will be an array of bools, and let's say I want dialogue for the first one, so it will be 0 and it will be 0 and 1, following this pattern right here. And if I look at the mapping, it would have another bool array, which is this one right here, which will decide whether it's going to be the player speaking or the NPC. And for this matter, it will be 0, 1, and this actually doesn't matter because like even if you set the bool for this one, it won't be read in our system. So let's say we have more interactions after this, and next interaction is going to be the NPC saying something back after you select the option. Now there can also be other variations of this, of how we approach the components of a conversation system. We'll just look at the other one, and in this one we'll have the same components, but they're just structured a little bit differently. So I'll just copy all of them here. So let's make one additional variable which records the length of the conversation, and this would usually be the number of interactions that the player has to go through. So let's say there's a dialogue of the NPC and there's options and there's another dialogue from the NPC, etc. And there can also be dialogue from the player. So in this case there will be like the length of the conversation will be 4, and we can take this and let's say it can be an int array. So if I copy this here, and let's say this is an int array, and when the conversation kicks off, it would check the length of the int array first. An int array is basically a collection of integers. So if I say 0 is a dialogue of the player and 1 is a dialogue of the NPC and 2 is an option, so that can be another approach where it would check the length first, and every time we go through one particular dialogue, it would reduce that in the length, and then it would end the conversation in itself. So let's say this is our approach, then we'll try to make this same structure here. So there's a dialogue of the player, so that's going to be 0. So it goes from here, since it is taking the first element of the int array. So if I branch out from here and say this is our first interaction, and that is a dialogue of the player because it's 0. So then we would have something like a string array called player dialogues, and a string array called NPC dialogues, and another string array called options. So this also can be of two types. There can be options with responses in the same. So what happens here is basically if I say, hey, how are you doing? Or where is the castle? Where can I find the castle? So these are 0 index and 1 index. So we'll be getting the responses for these options within the same string array. So let's say, where can I find the castle? And the second one will be, what was that noise? Something like that, right? And starting from 3, it would be responses. I'm doing good, something like that. I'm like writing really bad dialogue. It's near the river. Go straight up ahead and follow the river, something like that. And let's say I was wandering too. Sounds ominous. Yeah. Okay. So basically that's one way to do it. But the issue here is if we have, let's say 3. Okay, this will. So basically, if we have a string array that functions like this, then we would need to get the length of the string array and divide it by 2. So that will be 6 by 2 in this case. And so after 3, it would be responses. And the same goes for any number of options. Another way to do options is to have these separated. So let's say the first string array is going to be only the options, and the second one will be these, and these will be responses. But it'll be a little bit harder for you to configure when you're writing for the NPC. Let's say if there is a single string array, then you can easily map it. So let's say I create 4 elements inside the string array, and those all will be questions, and I'll be writing the answers below them. That's more easier than having like this. It might also be a personal choice, but we can do both of these in the same way that I'm going to show you. So okay, we'll go one level up and see what's happening here. So the conversation 1 will trigger the dialogue, and based on the dialogue it would display that particular text. Alright, I think that's enough for the explanation. It might seem a little bit more complicated now, but you'll slowly start to understand once we start making it. So don't worry, and we'll just dive in to Unity first. So I have my NPC selected here and this conversation setup, and let's create a variable for our conversations. So I'm gonna call this conversation 1, and I'm gonna use an int for the type. So we'll be using int as the array type. So let's say I have 3 components in this particular conversation, and the first one is going to be player dialogue, which will be 0, and the next one will be an NPC dialogue. Actually, let's just make this input so that we can easily configure it here. So the player talks, NPC talks, and we have a set of choices. So I'm gonna increase it to 1 more, make it 4. And after the choices are made, the NPC would speak again. And that's basically our conversation. Alright, so if we go into the state, and let's call this conversation 1 instead of conversation setup, We could also do multiple conversations, like have multiple arrays of ints, and those will be our normal conversations. So I'm gonna quickly rename this to start conversation, and since we already have the conversation one int array, we can just add get array next, and in here we can select our conversation one, and start index is 0, end index can also be 0, and then this loop event. We'll talk about what loop event is in a bit, but basically you'll need to know that this is what makes the conversation get the next child every time. So if I have a state here and do something in this state and then go back to this one, it would then loop and then it would advance by 1, so it will go to the next element in the array. You'll understand more about it once we start implementing it. So let's say I want the result, and we'll call this conv element. So here I'm gonna create a new event for the loop event and call it check basically. So what this will do, if I connect it to state 1, and let's rename this to check type of interaction, and so basically we have this conv element selected. So we'll do an int switch, which is basically if I select the conv element, and you can see there's only one int switch right now. If I make it into 3, I can compare it to 0, 1 and 2, and then send different events based on the result. So I'll just put them here, and this is dialog player, this is going to be dialog NPC, and this is going to be options. So if I drag from the dialog player and create a new state, and I'm gonna call it dialog player just so we know, and I'm gonna create different states for each of them, and this will be options. And for dialog player, what we need is the dialog box. So we need a reference for the dialog box so that we can set the speaker to the player. So what I'm gonna do is create a variable, and actually we already have the interaction UI, so I'm gonna access that. So I'm gonna create a reference to the dialog box, and I'll call this dialog UI and make it an input, and this will be this dialog box. So once I assign it, I can access it here, and I'm gonna set FSM game object, and that'll be almost similar to this one because we just duplicated that FSM for the other UI. So I'm gonna call this speaker, and I'm gonna set the value to the player. So right now we don't have any player reference, so that is going to be an issue. So I'll go to the player, and in the movement FSM, and I'm gonna search for get owner, and this is the first time we'll be using a global variable called player, and I'm gonna drag this all the way to the top. So now we can go back to npc2 and we can access the globals, and you'll see player in that. The same can be accessed from over here, global variables, under Playmaker, editor windows, and global variables. You can even dock it somewhere so that you can like debug it. So once that is set, the UI will start moving towards the player, and that's exactly what we want. So in the dialog box right now we have the dialog text. So if it is a dialog of the player, we will need the text to be set to that particular thing. Here I forgot to set the dialog UI as the game object, so I'm gonna quickly set that. And also I'm gonna get the child of the dialog UI. I'm gonna get the dialog UI, and child index is 0 is tail, and dialog text is 1. So I'm gonna get 1 and store it as the dialog text game object, and this is what we'll change. And before we change that, we need to create some variables for the dialogues. So I'm gonna go to my variables tab, and create another array. I'm going to call this player dialogues. I'm gonna set the array type to string, and here I'm gonna give it a value of 2 right now. I'm gonna also mark it as an input so that we can type in our dialogues here. In the same way, I'm gonna copy this name and I'm gonna create another array called npc dialogues. Actually, let's just make the npc small, and this will be an array of strings, and this will be an input as well. So let's just take a look at the existing conversation that we need. So right now it says that it starts off with the npc who is an old storyteller. So I'll just quickly copy this and go to our npc. I'm gonna paste the first dialogue here. So once we have that, I will create another array for the choices. So if I open up our sketch here, we can either go with this approach or this approach. So for the sake of the tutorial, we'll be using this approach where each option and response set will be a single string array. I'll just show you what I mean by that in a second. I'll just create another variable type of array called options set1. So that will be the first set of options and responses based on. So if I copy, so let's say these are the choices that we need to have. So I'm gonna start pasting each of the choices in the first few slots, and there we go. So we have 3 options, and the next 3 are going to be the responses for each of them. I'm gonna paste a smaller version of the answer. There we go. So once the options are populated, we can go ahead into the individual states and flesh them out. So for the dialogue player, I'm going to get the dialogue UI's child index 1, which is going to be the dialogue text, and this game object is going to be stored as dialogue text. So if I just drag the dialogue text into the state, I can look for UGUI set text. That is the action that we are looking for. But once we drag, we can change this back to the variable, which is going to be dialogue text, and this is going to be our npc, our player dialogue element 0. So we need to tell that it's going to be element 0, and then it needs to append every time it comes to this state. So how do we do that? We can just get the child, we can say get array next, and we can go for player dialogues, and we don't need to go into the start index and end index, but we can just store the result. I'm gonna store this as the dialogue, and once we do that, we can just set the text to dialogue. And once that is done, it needs to wait for the player to press some button. So I'll just search for any key. So I'll use any key, and this is going to finish and go back to the start conversation state. So in the start conversation state, it's going to check for the next array. So that is going to be this one in the conversation 1, and then it would go to the int switch and check whether it's going to be a dialogue for the player or the npc, etc. So here we also need to set the dialogue UI's follow object as the player, and similarly we can copy most of this. Actually, let's just copy all of them and paste them here, but this time we are going to use this same object as the value. Alright, so we already have a reference to the current game object here, so I'm going to use that, and that's going to tell the UI that it needs to follow the npc, and once that is done, it can go back to this particular state. Now things get complicated when it's options. I'll tell you exactly why, but before that I just want to test this out. So right now it is 0, 1 and 2, which is options. So I'm going to change that to 1 and 0. Actually, let's just change it to 0, 0, 1, 0, 1. And I'm going to put some example dialog 2. And I'm going to paste the same thing, except I'm going to add player to the end of it. So once I do that, we can just hit play and test whether that system is working, whether it's checking the conversation properly. So here we need to change the array that we are getting the dialogue from player dialogues to NPC dialogues. And once that is done, I think it should work perfectly fine. Actually, let's just delete the any key and use something else. I'm gonna use the same E key for the conversation advancement as well, because if I use my WASD keys, it's advancing the conversation, which I don't want. So if I go to the range and press E, and if I move around, you can see that it's following the player. And if I press E again, you can see that the dialogue is going back to the NPC. Let's advance the conversation, and you can see that it's working perfectly. So once that is done, I want to expand on the most complex part of this FSM, which is going to be the options.